My name is Kayla Vincent, and I'm here on behalf of the Black Allied Law Students Association to introduce Mabre Staley Butts, who is the Deputy Director of Racial Justice at the Center for Popular Democracy, a high-impact national organization that builds organizing power to transform the local and state policy landscape through deep, long-term partnerships with leading community-based organizing groups nationwide. She joined the Center for Popular Democracy as a Soros Justice Fellow in 2013, focusing on organizing and working with families directly affected by policing and criminal justice policies in New York City in order to develop meaningful, bottom-up policy reforms. Her work at the center also focuses on working on police and criminal justice reform with partners across the country. Mabre is also a member of the Movement for Black Lives policy table and one of the drafters of A Vision for Black Lives, policy demands for Black power, freedom, and justice. She received her BA summa cum laude from Columbia University, her master's in African Studies at Oxford University, and her JD from Yale Law School. In law school, she focused on the intersection of criminal justice and civil rights and gained legal experience working with the Bronx Defenders, the Equal Justice Initiative, and the Prison Policy Initiative. We are very honored to have her here in conversation with us tonight.
How y'all doing tonight? Yeah, good. I'm a call and response course. This whole thing is going to be, if I ask a question, it's not rhetorical. Like, I need y'all to say something. So let me first say it is an incredible honor to be here. There are folks on this stage who I regard as heroes, and I'm fans of their work and just their dedication and commitment. I also, as a person who went to law school, am incredibly excited that this conversation is happening at a law school. I think the idea of abolition as like a legitimate construct to even discuss was not present at my law school. And so I'm just grateful for the organizers and for this opportunity to really have this conversation. I am not a poet. Not a very good one. I'm not a monstrously fabulous youth organizer, and I'm not a movement leader. And so I have notes, 10 pages of notes. But I'm going to try and wing it as much as I can, so thank you for your patience. So I want to do 3 things tonight in 10 minutes, because I am actually the child of preachers, so I will go long. So I hope there was someone with like hand signals being like, no, y'all, you done. But I want to do 3 things. One is to talk about kind of my own personal evolution from what I would call kind of a liberal reformer who thought that like drugs shouldn't be illegal, but like abolition's a really scary term, and like what does that even mean? To someone who like is very proud and excited to say that I'm an abolitionist, and I'm constantly exploring and thinking about ways to materialize that and actualize it in my work and in my life. And so that's been a transformation, a revelation for me that I want to share with folks because I think it's important. Secondly, talk about the importance of an abolitionist frame in this moment as we are seeing the proliferation of reforms that are consolidating state power, and why abolition and a real recognition of the rottenness of the roots of this system are necessary for us to actually change it and have an era that is not defined by a new type of surveillance or incarceration or state violence, but actually a whole different way of being in this world for Black folks, for poor folks, for all of us. And then lastly, about the folks who are doing that work, because it's happening. There are folks who are doing incredibly radical. And when I say radical, I'm speaking of kind of the Ella Baker definition of things that grasp at the roots, that refuse just symptoms, but actually strive to address the root causes of things. So there are folks who are doing radical work, some of them in this room, many of them on this stage, who are really moving forward an abolitionist frame in different ways. So I want to talk a bit about the policy side, because I'm a policy girl. I like dream in policy. I think about policy in the shower. So I'm going to share kind of some policy ideas, but also folks on the stage will share, I think, organizing ideas that are essential to moving towards both creating alternative systems, but also alternative laws. Does that sound good to folks? So that's like the next 5 minutes or 10 minutes. Beautiful. So I grew up in a family that was deeply impacted by both the criminal justice system. Ooh, it's about to go down. Okay.
No, I saw it. I saw that.
You saw that.
Yeah, I did.
Thank you. So I grew up in a family that that was plagued by addiction and also by criminal justice intervention, and also by folks, women and men, who were both witness to and were the victims of violence, so sexual violence and other types of violence. And I think growing up in my mind, I had to say that my father, who was a crack addict, had no place in jail, that he did not belong there. But folks who had harmed my mother or my friends maybe did belong there, right? And so I had no conception of a different system. There was no challenge to even imagine a different system to deal with things that were really scary for us, scary for me, scary for my family, and traumatic. And I believed that jail or prison was a necessary evil in some ways, even though I knew that it didn't actually help. I was aware that folks who went into jail were in fact exposed to more violence. I was aware that for my family, that after incidences of trauma, that having someone locked up in a cage didn't actually heal the wounds that they felt or suffered, but nonetheless didn't have any other alternative to even think about what a system that didn't include prisons and jails and cages would look like. And so in my mind, and I mentioned this kind of violence, non-violence dichotomy, because I think in this moment, as we're looking at reforms, a lot of us get stuck in this dichotomy. That as if the system we have now, that cages and cruelty and deprivation of freedom and liberty and even basic human rights is acceptable for anybody, no matter what they've done. And so I think someone already said this, the idea of dignity, that there are people, that people don't deserve that treatment no matter what has happened, and that jails aren't the most effective way to deal with crime, was not something that I was ever even exposed to or talked about in any kind of real way. And it was actually, I went to Zimbabwe during my master's program and then lived there for a year, and that was the first time I was exposed to folks who were actually thinking about violence outside of cages and outside of this impulse to punish. And for me, it was a transformational experience, I think, for two reasons. One is because folks in Zimbabwe had actually bore witness to massive genocide, right? And so, we're gonna just do it this way. Had actually bore witness to massive genocide. And so in the 1980s, Mugabe had actually killed hundreds of thousands of folks in Matabeleland, which is the northern part of Zimbabwe. And folks had actually watched their husbands, their sons, their daughters be disappeared in the middle of the night, buried in mass graves next to their homes and their farms. And so folks had seen incredible trauma. And despite that, kind of 20 years later, I was part of a church group, so it was a missionary, and then also an organizing and lawyer group that were supporting folks in Matabeleland to really think about how do we heal our community in a way that isn't about the state. Because the state had perpetuated this violence, right? And so there were folks who were living alongside the same folks who had killed their fathers, who had killed their uncles, and trying to figure out how do we actually build a community and repair ourselves so that we're all stronger. And in Zimbabwe, the way that they did that mostly was through two different ways. One was through kind of restorative and reparative justice. And so that meant that there were conversations, really hard conversations that happened. There was accountability in some ways that happened. There was reburials, and so folks would dig up the mass graves and rebury people in individual graves with traditional ceremonies. And so there was this idea that, in fact, the way we heal is not through a system that cages or punishes, that we've seen that and it failed. But we have to actually, as a community, come together and think about other ways that we can actually maintain and repair these harms, right? Because there is no cage that will bring back your father. The other thing that they were doing in Zimbabwe that was really interesting was economic development. That one of the big causes, at least as folks there understood it, of the violence was a lack of economic opportunity and competition. And so they were building dams, doing collective farming together, and those were folks who actually had witnessed other folks kill their family, and despite that were able to really think about and move towards this restorative justice model. And it was, for me, shocking, right? Because this level of trauma, what it means to have to see your son or your daughter disappear, and then to be able to step through that and think about ways to repair your community that don't involve jails or punishment, was a revelation for me in lots of ways. And so I came back to Zimbabwe and went to law school, which was a huge disappointment for those of you in law school. And I think law school was super interesting for me for two reasons. One is the idea of abolition was never introduced, and those concepts that I had picked up on in Zimbabwe were never discussed. But I was exposed to a lot of critical race theory, a lot of scholarship that undermined any illusion I had in the legitimacy of this system, and made it really clear to me that all of the laws that we learn and abide by are in fact legitimizing and furthering a system that is meant to protect wealth, privilege, and and the status quo in lots of ways. And so for me, law school was this very interesting experience of both being incredibly exposed to critical race theory, to Ruthie Gilmore, to Angela Davis, who I stalked on YouTube, to critical resistance, which is an amazing group you all should Google if you don't know, and to others. But it also was a time when everything I learned in the classroom in some ways legitimized these systems that we're part of. And there was no exposure or even like room for debate to be like, that's not fair. Like, what is my experience and what's the legitimacy of my experience in this moment, right? So law school undermined that. But it was an interesting intellectual moment for me. And so it really was in the last few years, the last 3 or 4 years, in being exposed to and part of movement that I've come to kind of an abolitionist frame and embrace that completely. And still every day I'm learning from folks about what that looks like and what that means. But there were 2 kind of major moments in movement for me. And when I say movement, I mean both kind of last 2 years since Michael Brown and Eric Garner here in New York, but also, and Umi, I hope will touch on this, but also the occupation of the Capitol in Florida after the death of Trayvon Martin, and just the incredible movement that we've seen, incredibly young often marginalized folks who have been brave enough and bold enough to put their bodies and their freedom on the line to make it clear that the emperor has no clothes on, that this system is guilty as hell, and that it's broken. And so I have been incredibly lucky through my job and my work to in some ways go to those places, some St. Louis, Minneapolis, Baltimore, and here in New York, and work with folks who are trying to actualize what it means to actually be free, and are working every day tirelessly to do that. And that's taken me all over, but one of the most kind of illuminating moments for me, at least, was in Minneapolis. And so Jamal Clark, do folks know Jamal Clark? So he's one of the many names of folks who we've lost. But Jamal Clark was killed by a police officer in Minneapolis. And after his killing, a group of folks occupied the 4th precinct in northern Minneapolis. And I just want to say that again, like occupied the 4th precinct. So folks came to the police station and occupied it. That's a big deal. That doesn't happen. So as a result of that, they were there for over 2 weeks, and they asked me to come down and help them figure out some policy demands. Like, what do we do with this moment? We have all this community energy, there's all this attention, like we want to really mobilize and figure out some systemic reforms that we can do. So I came down and I had like a list of, like, I'm a good progressive lawyer, I got 15 reforms we can talk about, we can do an IG, community oversight, you want body cameras, like, what we doing? And I get there and I'm like, you know, I can help, here's what I know about, and they're like, we want to abolish the police. And I was like, yep, exactly, take a moment. And I was like, oh, okay. And they're like, no, really, like, what can we do? What policies can we put in place right now that will lead us toward a future where there is no police in this city? And for me, that was saying that, I mean, yes, of course, police, like, we should abolish police, but to think about that in a policy way, to be like, yo, what are the next steps we can take today that will move us closer to a world in which police are not harassing, surveillancing, killing, beating our children and our people, was for me a revolutionary experience. And that folks who were on the ground, folks whose bodies had been most impacted, were brave enough to actually imagine that, and I wasn't. And so what it was for me was a process that's been ongoing for more than a year of what does it actually mean to actualize abolition in the policy we do? And that's not that every single policy, and this is said by lots of folks, but it's not that every single policy is an abolitionist policy. But how do we ensure that everything that we push moves us closer to a vision of a world without cages, without police, without state violence in a real way. And in Minneapolis, y'all should look up, they have a United Black Legislative Agenda, which they created, that is moving towards that exact thing. And slow and steady, as all things are, but is doing that work. I think the other moment for me that moved me towards abolition was the Movement for Black Lives platform. And so everyone should check it out. There's a copy on the table. And that was actually, it was a process that lasted for over a year and a half and included over 70 groups from across the country who were doing base building work with folks. And I think very often we assume or we think or we say that the folks who are most impacted are not the most radical. Like there's this kind of theory of like abolition is a theory of like of intellectuals in white towels and who are doing, but I mean what I have found is that folks who are actually in the trenches, who are doing the work every day, have a conception of a necessity to dismantle this system, to starve this system, and to reimagine the system. And that is actually abolition. And that is what's coming out of public housing, that's what's coming out of folks who are actually most exposed and are most impacted by these policies. And I think key to the M4BL platform and my ideology as a lawyer is that we have the democratized policy, because the folks who are actually best equipped, who have the expertise to come up with the solutions, are those who are most impacted, not those who went to law school or have spent the last 3 years not being exposed to it, right? And so I think the M4BL process was incredible, not because everyone in that space identifies as abolitionists, because they don't, but because together we came up with a set of principles that is very akin to abolition. And I want to just mention 3 of those principles, because I think they're at the heart of this conversation. One is the idea that we need a radical realignment of power, that there was no reform, there was no tweak, there was no body camera law, and we can talk about body cameras over drinks, it's a disaster, but there was no single tweak of this system that actually will move us towards liberation, that what actually is necessary is a realignment, a radical realignment of power. The second principle that I think is really relevant is that we will make no policy that harms any Black lives, any of them. That means if you've been condemned, if you have done horrible things that are unthinkable to us, we still would not create a policy that is dehumanizing to you, because we believe that all Black lives matter. And if they don't all matter, then none of them matter. And the last principle was this idea that we would not support any reforms, even if there was some short-term benefit that consolidates state power or corporate power. And this is actually, I mean, Miriam Keba, who will speak soon, has an amazing article in Truth Out, is that it? Which has changed my life, and which I send to everyone, which lays out some principles of police reform, and I think that these are akin to those in many ways. But so for me, kind of after the last 2 years, I find myself squarely in the category of the abolitionist, but the question still is, what does that mean? And also, why is that so important right now? And I think there's 2 key reasons why it's really important in this moment, which I think is pregnant with possibility. We have folks on both sides of the aisle, Democrats and Republicans, talking about de-incarceration, talking about mass incarceration as a problem in this country, although they both built it collaboratively. Nonetheless, they've seen the error of their ways, evidently. And I think very often talk about it in a profit lens of this is too expensive, it's too costly. But despite the last 2 years or 3 years or 10 years or 200 years really of movement and of folks being incredibly brave and incredibly radical, what we've actually seen in the last 3 years is a consolidation of state power and a move towards privatization. And there's 3 key examples of this. I think there's the local example, the state example, and the federal example. On the local level, we've seen a huge increase in police budgets. Here in New York City, we saw the hiring of 1,000 new cops right after the death of Eric Garner, despite the fact that we have the 7th largest standing army in the world, 7th in the world. And we also, across the country, have seen an increase in police budgets and a hiring of new police. And this is mostly because of body cameras, which there's been 16 states that have passed body camera legislation, almost none of them with any accountability or written guidelines required. We've also seen a huge increase in trainings, as if training police officers will somehow end systemic racism or the dehumanization of Black people and bodies. Nonetheless, everyone wants to talk about training. And so we've seen these huge budget increases in local budgets around these 2 issues, and the additional hiring of police. And so what we see in places like Oakland is that more than half of the municipal budget is going towards policing and incarceration, not towards preschool, which actually is shown to decrease crime in the long run, not towards living wages, which again has been shown to decrease crime in the long term, unlike police, which have not. So we've seen in the last 3 years, despite this incredible movement and energy, real consolidation of power at the local level. At the federal level, despite a lot of talk, a commission, and some other measures, what we've actually seen is the increase of about $250 million towards body cameras that's been earmarked. And we also have seen an executive order around 1033, which is a program that is supposed to give local departments and schools, in some cases, military equipment. In the last year, it's actually increased its provision of military equipment to folks, not decreased it. And that's despite an executive order. At the state level, we've seen an increased reliance on surveillance as a form of non-incarceration. So across the country, folks are hiring private companies, paying Taser United, which is a company that for years, for decades, has killed and injured our people, to now produce body cameras and ankle bracelets. And so we've seen this real increase and profitization around measures that are supposed to decrease incarceration. So I say all that to say that one of the incredibly important things about abolition is that it denies a recreation of this system. That what we have seen over and over again, and I think that Michelle Alexander and Kimberly Crenshaw and other folks have articulated this better than I will, but from slavery to Jim Crow to mass incarceration and now to a surveillance state, we see that these systems recreate themselves over and over again, and the same folks profit and the same folks suffer from them. And that is in part because of a misdiagnosis of the problems that we face. If we recognize that this criminal justice system evolved out of the slavery era as a way to control black bodies, to degrade black labor and exploit it, and to diminish black political power, and by extension, the political power of all folks who are minorities, all folks who live in poverty-stricken areas, of all folks, that if we understand that, we understand the roots of this system are fundamentally rotten, and what's necessary is not a tweaking, not a reform, but instead a complete destruction of and a reimagining. And a reimagining not just of policies or practices, but also of the very purpose of this system. If we want to keep people safe, if we want strong communities, then investment in jobs, investments in education, investments in employment and health are in fact the way that we get there, and not investments in policing and incarceration. So I'm sure I'm out of time. So I'm going to quickly talk about kind of some of the policy work that's happening right now that I think moves us closer to those objectives. So number one was already mentioned, and that's the invest-divest frame. And so across the country, BYP 100 calls it Fund Black Futures. Folks are doing work to say we need not only an investment in black folks, because in the last 30 years, as we've seen this incredible explosion of the carceral state, we've also seen steady divestment from education, from mental health, from drug treatment, across the country. And so we've seen the same area codes that are over-policed are under-invested in every other possible way. And so what needs to happen is not just a reinvestment, or let me not say re, because it never happened, not only an investment in our communities, but also a divestment from police, incarceration, surveillance. I'm gonna keep saying surveillance, because watch out, surveillance is coming, and it's the new way that we're criminalizing folks. But a divestment from those systems and using that money, which is in the trillions of dollars, that we throw money at the criminal justice system with no evidence of its success. But a reinvestment of those dollars into our health, our education, our employment, and community organizations that are doing the work will make us safer. And folks across the country, Make the Road, Ella Baker, Safety on Policing here in New York, which is a Baji and some other folks, are doing that work. Folks in Chicago, BYP 100. So across the country, we're seeing a real attempt at the city and the state level to demand a divestment from policing and an investment in our communities. The other thing is decriminalization. So throughout the 1990s and before, we saw the proliferation of literally thousands of new laws. So in California, there were 1,000 new criminal laws put on the books in 20 years. In Minnesota, there was an average of 20 laws a year, as if like new things became illegal. Like all of a sudden, it's super dangerous for you to walk that way. And what we actually saw was a criminalization of poverty, first and foremost, right? So it's illegal to sleep on benches. It's illegal to loiter, even if you don't have a home. So we've taken your home away from you, and now you can't stay here. And also criminalization of cultural practices. So you can't sit on your stoop and have a beer. Like that is now an illegal activity you're engaged in. And so across the country, we saw this proliferation of criminal statutes that had nothing to do with safety, that resembled the black codes, essentially, and that allowed police the discretion to stop, arrest, and harass whoever they wanted, because right now you're breaking the law. I guarantee you. Like half of y'all in this room, lawbreakers, right now. And so the idea of scaling back on what we think belongs in the criminal justice sphere is a really important idea. How do we decriminalize activity that is not actually a threat to public safety and take it out of the orbit of police to enforce? And so folks across the country in Atlanta, I know there's some Atlanta folks in the house. Go ahead, Nalini's here too. In Atlanta and across the country are pushing for a repeal of local ordinances and state ordinances to just make it not, like, it's not illegal to be a human, it's not illegal to be a black person in this country. How do we actually actualize that, right? And then secondly, there's a real push across the country. So Minneapolis also just did this. They decriminalized loitering, which was used against black folks nearly 3 times as much as against other folks. So in addition to the policy work around decrim and invest, divest. I would also add reparations to that, which is a longer conversation, which we should all have over drinks. But the importance of actually looking back and repairing past harms in order to move forward is a really essential one. And in addition to the policy work happening, there's also an incredible amount of work that folks are doing to reimagine how we actually deal with trauma. That trauma, pain, violence are real things that happen in our communities, and part of that is prevention. That if folks have access to employment, to housing, to mental health services, to drug services, that they are likely to commit less crimes. But it also means that when trauma does happen, how do we deal with that? And there are folks across the country, some on this stage, who are doing that work. Critical Resistance, Dream Defenders is doing harm-free zones, as is Spirit House, and folks from Chicago to New York City are doing incredible restorative justice. And I say all of that to say that there was hope. We are in a moment where the idea of abolition, I think, is resurfacing as a possibility, but the real need to assess the full scope of this problem, to recognize the roots are rotten, and to challenge, I think, ourselves inside of both legal institutions, organizing spaces, and our own homes, to reimagine how we deal with trauma, how we deal with violence is essential if we don't want to just recreate the same systems we're inside of. So thank you all. That was long. I appreciate your patience.